happened when love has taken hold and it won't let go of us now.
Something here is calling us forward, upward motion. We're drops in one ocean. Roll on.
Will you rise up with me today? Lift up your voice
and boldly say,
we are the ones we've been waiting for.
Live the dream of your highest calling. Be the hope of a new day dawning. We're the ones who can make a difference. Let's stand together, sharing gifts for the world that's waiting for a change that we're all creating. It's the
Good evening, everyone, and thanks to all of those who are joining us live tonight on this webinar, New Thought on the News, and to those of you who will be looking at the recording a little bit after. This is our 5th session in 2018 of New Thought on the News, and we're always joined by author and AGNT colleague Jim Kenney. And tonight our special guest is Dr. Ken Gordon, spiritual leader of Centers for Spiritual Living, and we will introduce them a little further just in a minute or two. I'm Dr. Barbara Fields, Executive Director of AGNT, and this series has been produced by AGNT to support us as a community in our mission of spiritually guided social activism. So we basically came up with the idea of New Thought on the News because everybody would agree it's time for a fresh and a much more conscious approach to the news of our times. And this series is a chance for us to have some real dialogue on the hot topics in the news, but as seen through the evolutionary lens of New Thought principles, something that we hope both of our speakers and our presenters tonight will agree could give us a little hope in the face of things that are sometimes rather demoralizing. So we're also joined tonight by my co-host, Stephen Pope, and I'm going to ask Stephen if he would go ahead and begin by introducing Dr. Ken Gordon.
I'd be very happy to. Our main speaker is Ken Gordon, who's the spiritual leader of the Centers for Spiritual Living and a council member of the Association for Global New Thought. As a spiritual leader, Ken is the public face of Centers for Spiritual Living. He's a well-known representative of the science of mind and religious science, who has represented New Thought all over the world over the last decade. He previously presented at both the Melbourne and the Salt Lake City World Parliaments of Religions. He travels extensively speaking on the need for all the world religions to rise above dogma and doctrine and to work together to help create a world that works for everyone. He is, together with his wife, Dr. Deborah Gordon, the co-founder of the Center for Spiritual Living in Kelowna, British Columbia, Canada, and is deeply committed to awakening humanity to the unity of all life and the personal responsibility that every human has to contribute to this life.
So welcome, Ken, and I wonder if I might impose on you to provide an opening blessing for our group tonight, as we often do here.
I'd be honored to do that, Barbara. So let's just each of us just find that common place that we know so well, that place that we're never separate from, and recognize and acknowledge that there's God and absolutely nothing else. That each of us is unified with this power and with this presence, with this intelligence, that it flows through us and as us. And I speak my word for this teleconference, this webinar tonight, recognizing and accepting and knowing that this is a divine invitation to those who are in attendance and those who are speaking. Understanding and embracing the concept that there is only one, we move forward with the highest and the greatest in mind. We allow that power, that individualization of the spirit that flows through each and every one of us to have its part within us. We remove any agenda or any block that prevents it from being there. And we simply enter into this knowing that this good idea called New Thought in the News by AGNT is an idea that helps amalgamate, grow, and expand the consciousness of humanity. Accepting that this is already done, that this is already the truth, I simply surrender it back into the universal mind, which is your mind and my mind, and I allow it to be my truth and live from it with expectation and anticipation. I let go and I let spirit run this show. And so it is.
Thank you, Ken. So moving right on, I'd like to introduce Jim Kenney. Once again, many of you have been on the series before, so you know Jim a little now. But for those who don't and who will be watching the recording a little later, Jim Kenney, as well as being a dear friend and longtime colleague of AG&T, is co-founder and executive director of Common Ground, which is an adult educational organization and study center that's headquartered near Chicago, Illinois. He is author of Thriving in the Crosscurrent, Clarity and Hope in a Time of Cultural Sea Change. He is founding trustee of the International Committee for the Peace Council and project coordinator, bringing together influential religious and spiritual leaders to serve world peace. He is co-editor of the Interreligious Insight Journal, and he is former founding trustee and global director for a Council for a Parliament of the World's Religions. Hi, Jim.
Hi, Barbara and Ken and Stephen.
Great. So we'll go right into today's salon. We call these online salons. As some of you might already know, the Foundations for New Thought on the News is the 4-part tutorial that we did earlier in the year based on Jim's book and his model of cultural sea change. So I would like to say that if you've not already seen this 4-part recorded tutorial, it's really worth checking out, and you can take some time with it and really go at your own pace, because the concepts you'll find there are very rich and a little bit complex. So if you just go to agt.today and look for the New Thought on the News salons, you'll easily find those recordings. There's also some valuable handouts there that'll help guide you through these conversations. So tonight's topic, I think, is appropriately called Global Spiritual Citizenship. And it's inspired by ideas such as, if we have a choice now to either be pushed by our pain or pulled by our vision, where many of us realize that the value systems that we've allowed to dominate our lives have resulted in the social reality we are experiencing. And so we're going to have the conversation tonight with Ken and Jim that look a little more closely into what's going on in the world today, but from a very different perspective than you'll see in the newspaper or on TV. So I would like Ken to begin the presentation just by giving us some general remarks about what constitutes a new thought perspective on current events, and what positive contribution to global spiritual citizenship can new thought principles bring to us.
Thank you, Barbara. I appreciate you immensely, as I'm sure you're aware. I really, you know, what's happening in the world today when we look around it, and I'm talking about the whole world, I'm just not talking about the United States, but what's occurring and what's taking place is probably a demonstration of something that we need to know. You know, we've set our prayers into motion, our treatments into motion, and we desire to have a vision of a world that works for everyone, or whatever that looks like. And we're moving forward, and everything unlike it's going to show up in our experience and in what we look at. So it's important, in my opinion, for us to go to 30,000 feet to be able to look down on the world that exists today. We're probably living in the most peaceful, the most productive, the most technologically savvy, the most evolutionary, and the most expanding time that we've ever had in the history of the world. We're sitting here in 2018 looking around us, and everything seems to be improving. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't other stuff to be done, because boy, there certainly is. However, what we're doing is we're moving forward in an evolutionary cycle. I often teach my students that my preference in life would be the consciousness that I would choose to have in my being, and I'm the first to admit that I don't have it, so please don't misunderstand me. But my choice would be that once I've set into motion what I intend to receive, I recognize and know that perhaps there'll be a few brambles and briars on my way to receive it. There'll be some friction and some things that are knocking me off my game, totally for the purpose of bringing into my conscious awareness what I need to know and what I need to be aware of in order to make the transformational changes that I need to make. And so when I talk to my students, what I tell them is that I would choose to be of the consciousness that when I step off of a sidewalk or when I step off of a curb, and if I were to sprain my ankle, instead of jumping up and down and screaming and yelling how horrible it is and projecting out into the world what a pain it is and how I'm going to have to go to church with a broken foot, etc., that instead what I do is actually go straight to the consciousness of saying, thank you, God. Thank you, Spirit. Thank you for what's brought me forward to here, so that there is something to be learned and something to be known. And then when I look at the circumstances of the world around us and realize that this is actually the best time ever, and that the experiences that we're finding that are conflictual right now are probably, or most certainly in my opinion, experiences that are opportunities for us to step into a greater consciousness, a greater appreciation of what's of value in our lives and what's for good in our lives.
Thanks, Ken. That's an excellent way to segue into the next piece, which and Jim is going to now talk to us a little bit about the concept of cultural sea change, but also introduce a wider topic of, in terms of global spiritual citizenship, what is going on, not just in our country, but around the world today, that is expressing exactly what you did just now, which is there's some friction and some bumps and missteps along the way that may also be catalysts for what we need to learn in order to create a better way as we see it. So, Jim, if you would just go right ahead now and start.
Well, that's very nicely put. I just want to say, because we don't rehearse this or plan this out, so I didn't know where Ken was going to go with that intro, but I couldn't agree more. I think that's a very strong statement. I've been reading and teaching, well, I've read it, and now I'm teaching from a book by Steven Pinker, who about 2 years ago wrote a wonderful book called The Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined, and makes the extraordinary argument. Everyone thinks they know that this isn't true until they hear his persuasive, compelling demonstration of it, but that the 20th century is the least violent in well-recorded history, and that goes all the way back to the 13th. Whether you're talking about deaths in war, but you'd have to project it against the total population, but everything from domestic violence to animal abuse to bar fights to you name it, to capital punishment and so on. And it's absolutely fascinating. There are a number of terrific TED Talks featuring Steven Pinker laying this out. But he's got a new book, and everyone should know about it. I think I mentioned it last time. It's called Enlightenment Now: The Case for Reason, Science, Humanism, and Progress. He says those are not old dead values. They're very much alive. And he actually said something that resonates with what Ken says. If you could control, if you could be reborn at this moment and control the epoch into which you would be reborn, you'd be crazy to pick any other time than this. So here's just again, I'm ad-libbing here, but I've got some materials. This is from Bill Gates, who I think has, we all wondered where he was coming from when he wouldn't shed or wouldn't share any of his billions, but he has more than made up for that. And he writes this, he says, here's a shocker. The world has made spectacular progress in every single measure of human well-being. Here's a second shocker. Almost no one knows about it. And then he lists about 20 titles, really upbeat books with titles like The Improving State of the World, Getting Better, The End of Doom, and so on. And he says none of these was recognized with a major prize. But over the period in which they appeared, Pulitzers in nonfiction were given to 4 books on genocide, 3 on terrorism, 2 on cancer, 2 on racism, and 1 on extinction. So what are the stories that we choose to tell ourselves? Well, there is a kind of depressing story in the news, very much in the news this past week. And it is that a coalition of fairly unusual populist parties have won power in Italy. And they have campaigned on a series of ever shifting, I mean, they can't decide what they're all about because they base their platform on the current state of clicks on their internet websites. So people get to kind of vote on what the platform should be, therefore it changes every day. But one of their strongest points is that we want to get out of the European Union. We want to make Italy great again. We are deeply concerned about the problem of immigrants. They're ruining the quality of life in Italy. There's a whole faction that think that it's homosexuals that are ruining Italian life, and another faction that thinks it's intolerance of homosexuality that's ruining Italian life. Both sides are kind of annoyed with women, just on general principles, and they want to pull out of the world, stop the world and want to get off. Well, as you look around Europe, there's an awful lot of that, an awful lot of these populist nationalist parties. I have a word or two that I wrote just to help us to understand what we mean by that. Populism suggests excessive pandering to the fear and indignation of the ordinary voter. A lot of people believe that populism, and many of our media pundits misuse the term, they believe that populism means listening carefully to the voices of the people. Actually, it doesn't, and that's not the way we have used it. I just lost the screen here, but in general, in political science and so forth, I'm rejoining the meeting. But essentially, it always means instead of playing to the hopes and dreams of people, or as I think we were quoting Michael Bernard Beckwith there, being pulled by our vision, instead of playing to the hopes and dreams and visions of people, we play to their fears and hatreds. And they're much easier to manipulate when that's the game you play. That's what populism is all about. Well, if that's the only news you heard last week, and then you heard us talking about the promise and the possibility of global citizenship, you'd think we were nuts. Because not only Italy, but also Greece and Hungary and Poland and France and the UK show signs of this very destructive, leave us alone, we want to be on our own, we don't want to be part of a global reality. Global reality is all smoke and mirrors and so on. You'd think that anybody that believes we're heading in that direction is nuts. But the good news, it seems to me, is that as a matter of fact, culture, and this is the whole point of what's Sea Change all about, what's the book, Thriving in the Cross Current, all about. Number one, it's about the idea that there is such a thing as cultural evolution. Human culture does move steadily in the direction of a closer fit with reality. Whenever I say that, people want me to define reality in some sort of elaborate philosophical way. I mean by reality what you mean by reality. We gradually realized that slavery was always and everywhere wrong, but it's wronger than ever now. That patriarchy was always mistaken, but it's more mistaken than ever now. That the earth was always fragile, but it is intolerable not to countenance that and take that into our consciousness today. And all of those things are happening. And the other part of the argument in the book, or one other part, is that cultural evolution, although it goes on all the time, there are periods in which it's dramatically accelerated. And I, to the consternation and surprise of even some of my friends, I insist that we are in one of those times of the dramatic acceleration of cultural evolution. There's an awful lot we could point to, and I'm sure that people listening are making their tally, and they're right. A lot of things to point to. We are ecologically blinder than we can afford to be. We've got craziness ascendant in this culture and other cultures. But I think it's important to realize, and so I wrote a little piece here. The good news is that these toxic cultural dynamics, like populism and nationalism, my country above all, I don't want to be part of anything global, that these toxic cultural dynamics need to be understood as forms of backlash against the steady progress of cultural evolution. Most of them will not survive the maturation and the rise to power of the next generation. Just as the nearly global approval of chattel slavery could not survive the century after the American Civil War, just as the folly of patriarchy, the unquestioning acceptance of male superiority under every human metric, patriarchy has dramatically declined since the mid-60s. Once again, as Ken said, nobody's claiming that the work is done, but anybody that doesn't notice how far we have come is not paying attention. And just as the dangerous denial of the Earth's fragility and the human role in disastrously testing its limits ebbs, not nearly quickly enough, but steadily. So the good news is that I think that that there are so many metrics. This is what Steven Pinker talks about in Enlightenment Now. This is what Bill Gates is talking about. This is where Ken was pointing. We are moving steadily in the direction of cultural evolution. And where does that converge? It converges in a shared sense of global citizenship. I have another little piece I'd like to read at the end. But how do I measure how can I claim to be a citizen of the United States or France or Australia or Canada? How can I make that claim if I am not first and foremost a citizen of the earth? And I think that would have made no sense to most of our grandparents, less sense than it makes to us, to our parents. And I think it makes total sense to the next generation.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. Exactly. There's so many points. There's so much food for thought there. I know that Ken is going to want to get in on the discussion and give some responses to you. And I just have to say that this generational notion of global spiritual citizenship is inevitable in so many ways, not the least of which is its facilitation by the technologies in the digital age that have developed, which have allowed the younger people all over the world to grow up in a world that feels extremely inclusive and very broad compared to the way that our generation, our parents and grandparents grew up. So there are no accidents, really. It's quite mathematical, if you ask me. So I'm going to ask Ken if he would now make some comments on what.
I would love to. I'm digesting this. If once again, I find myself in a situation where I just am chuckling to myself, is that we all think alike. We have different language, we have different ways of putting it, but generally speaking, humanity wants the same thing. And I totally agree with everything that Jim said, every single word that he said. And there are always people who are going to be there that appear to be obstructionists, but the reality is what they really are is they are inciters. They are moving us forward to that greater idea. The master teacher Jesus said that the poor in spirit will always be with us. And I have no doubt that that's probably true, and it's demonstrated in Italy, it's demonstrated in France, it's demonstrated in Canada, for heaven's sakes, and it's demonstrated in the US right now in some of the things that we're seeing and some of the things we're experiencing. And what we as a New Thought community, in my opinion, need to realize is that a greater idea that we can have to get out of our stories is probably the idea that will be the most popular when we move forward. Raymond Charles Barker once told me that when he ran into conflict in his life, he would go into his den and he would close his den door and he'd say, "Barker, you need a bigger idea." What society needs is a bigger idea. We need a bigger idea than the ones that we're dealing with right now, where we are dealing with what our grandparents thought, and somehow or other thinking that that has to be gospel in the way that we work our life and run our lives. And when I say we, I'm really talking about me. I know that there are millions of avatars out there who already know this and are already connected to it. But we need a bigger idea around what our life could be, as opposed to what we're looking at it. We're kind of dependent upon the old fear motive that Jim mentioned to be able to manipulate society rather than utilizing the natural recourse and the natural inspiration that we get from life itself. And to do that, what we, in my opinion, require is to collect the collective consciousness to move in a different direction than what we're moving in right now. I visualize the 7.5 billion of us on this planet recognizing and knowing that, just to throw a figure out there, there's 100 million people who think we have to stay the way we've always been. And they're moving in one direction. They're still moving in the direction of manipulation. They're still moving in the direction of using fear as a power. And we see it rampant in our media. And yet there's another group of us, which are people like us, the cultural creatives, the New Thought communities. And it's not just that we're doing business with the Pentecostals, with the Baptists, with Catholics, with Jewish rabbis, moving in a direction where what we're doing is laying down our dogma and doctrine and instead picking up and utilizing our vision, saying, how can we help each other to get where we need to get? To develop and build into the world a greater idea so that what we can deliver to the world is what they really want, as opposed to what their stories are sticking them in. And that so many people, it appears, are advertising that fear motive, saying if you do that, this is going to happen, which is not true in any way, shape, or form. So we're finding ourselves in an experience where it demands that we get a greater idea than the one that we've had in the past. And the greater idea, whether you call it a world that works for everyone, or you just simply call it a place where the individual can feel free within society itself, which is what the founding fathers of the United States developed and designed, then we find ourselves in a situation where we need to begin to think differently than what we thought in the past. We need to begin to have a different norm for what we want to have happen. And that different norm is a norm that says that life can be better tomorrow, not worse. And that to get there, to attain that, it requires that we actually have the chutzpah, the guts, the courage to stand up and stand for what we believe instead of sheepishly standing in the background. I can't help but notice that, that there's a lot of to-do in this day and age about Russia manipulating the election in the United States, for example. And while that certainly is concerning, the more concerning point is the 49% of the people in the US who didn't even vote, which really elected Donald J. Trump. And I'm not saying that to be a negative on Donald J. Trump, because he's a blessing to us and we pray for him every day. But the reality is that if people were to actually become responsible for what they need to be a global citizen, we would transform this world in half a decade instead of having to wait a century to see it manifest or become the reality of our experience. But it requires that we stand up for what we want to be true. There's no reason why everybody in the world shouldn't have a home or water or food. There's no reason for children to die anymore. There's no reason for war. All it requires is for us to have a bigger idea. And what Jim Kenney's talking about is exactly that. Cast off the manipulation by fear. Put your mind towards what it is that we choose to have in life. And I guarantee you that 9 out of 10 people that you run into want it the same way. The only difference is they think that they can have it by doing the old way of doing it. So we'll get back to this population that's moving, where 100 million people are moving 7.5 billion. It requires us to be able to create a collective consciousness of 101 million people, or 100 million plus one, moving in the opposite direction. Because the key is that 7.5 billion, or the mass of the population, is taking the pathway of least resistance. And so to do it, we need to come together as new thought communities, which is what Association for Global New Thought's all about, to be able to move the consciousness of humanity into a direction that's going to actually start utilizing some 21st century ideas and ideals that's going to get us to what we want as opposed to what we've got. And so once again, I really realize that wherever I go and whoever I talk to, when you get past the protectionism that people put around their ideas, what you find is that most people, the vast majority of humanity, want the same thing. We want safety, we want comfort, we want to be able to have access to the assets of society, and there is a way for us to be able to do that. But to do that, it demands that we stop trying to manipulate in the 19th century way and begin actually to have a new way to be able to move into it. Evolution is happening even as we speak. When I watch what's happening in the world right now, I see voices standing up and shouting out against the things that have blocked us and stopped us to this point. And that voice will be heard, and we will transform, and we will evolve.
Thanks, Ken. I'm eager to go back and watch the recording of this program, even though it's not done yet, because so many interesting things have been said, and they're inspiring me to think about concepts such as, say that we wanted to try to stop evolution. Think about how difficult that would be. I don't think we could stop it if we wanted to. And it brings to mind the quote by Buckminster Fuller that I can only paraphrase, having something to do with that you can't tear down an existing broken system by fighting against the system. The way to do it is basically to be pulled by another vision and to construct on your own terms the new system you want to see that makes the old system obsolete. And it goes right into another paraphrase of a quote that by Gandhi, who was talking to people who said, we don't know how to take action because we're not sure that we can ensure the outcome. And basically he just said, well, you can never ensure the outcome, and that's not what you should be focused on. You just should know that if you do nothing at all, there will be no result. Because that we are society, we are the social force, and that's how things move. So Jim, I want to give you a chance to make some comments and maybe just open it up a little bit to free-form discussion. And also, Stephen, if you have any remarks to make along the way as you've been listening, feel free.
Well, I think what I'm most fascinated by, first of all, I agree with Ken that, if you break down some of the barriers, not just barriers of protectionism, but also the fact that we don't speak deeply the same languages. And we need to share a lot more learning before we can discover the degree to which we we agree. But I do think that that fundamental human agreement, I use the phrase the emerging global consensus, emerging only in the sense that we're finding out about it. But I think it was pre-existing in the sense that, yeah, all of the things you listed are things that make sense to people, that people need, that people want, and so on. But it requires a fair amount of learning and shared learning and dialogue for us to begin to realize that when it comes to core issues like peace and nonviolence, social and economic justice and universal human rights, ecological sustainability, that I talk about PJS, those three all the time. And on those and on many other issues, there is absolutely an emerging global consensus. That's what puts a spring in my step on those mornings when there is a spring in my step, and what makes me confident in that we are capable of moving toward a felt sense of global citizenship and an even deeper sense, ideally, of global spiritual citizenship. So people often accuse me of being an optimist. I often hear, I wish I could be as optimistic as you. And I really always want to counter, no, I'm not an optimist. The optimist is one who says, ladies and gentlemen, I've surveyed all the available information and the news is good. That's not my position. My position is that there is always more reason for hope than there will ever be for despair. So that'll do for now.
Ken, do you have any more to say, or Stephen, did you want to pipe in here? Okay, no Stephen, but Ken, go ahead.
Yeah, and I'm totally, once again, in agreement. I spend an incredible amount of time in spiritual practice because I watch the news. It's something that's required of me to keep an eye on it. So, you know, I'll watch an hour of news, and that warrants about 2 hours of getting back to reality because I get drifted off so much. And what's the most disappointing point that I see in the whole thing is that it doesn't have to be this way. You know, if people were to become involved, you would see a transformation that took place because we're not speaking something that other people don't resonate with. As a matter of fact, we're speaking the resonant truth for most people if they could hear it without having their bias come in as to who we are and where we come from. And yeah, you know, I just have to say, you know, we're very comfortable, and the Buddhists have always said all change comes from within, the old jokes that come out around that. We can't disassociate ourselves from the world at this point. What is required is that like-minded, sane people need to get involved, and they need to step into it. And even though it's uncomfortable and doesn't look like it's a place they want to be, the requirement is that we actually participate in our society and in the systems that we have created and that are the effect of what we have done up until this particular point so that we can make that transformation. When I see the young adults and the children that came out of Florida after the shooting standing up and taking a stand, I am so encouraged. Because those are the people that I want to run my world. And we need to step up, and we need to step in with logical common sense. There's a lot of stuff going on around the world right now which doesn't have to be going on. And if we weren't dealing in the old paradigm of how we think, what we would find is we would find that it was transformative, or it could be transformative. And so, you know, when we're talking about optimism, I have nothing but hope for the world. You know, our teacher says that, Ernest Holmes says that we look at life as though it's through a keyhole. And that is exactly what the truth is. And we need to broaden that out so that we can look at life for what it really is. And when we do, we'll understand that it's not supposed to be all nice and sweet and optimistic. What it's supposed to be is it's supposed to be an exercise in evolving who we are from where we came from to where we want to be. And I don't believe we'll ever find a time that we're totally evolved, at least not on this plane, I don't believe. But we will eventually move and transform the world if we become conscious, creative evolutionaries and actually begin moving our society forward for the goodness of life, as opposed to buying into the old stuff that's been hanging around for 2,000 years.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Ken. I muted you a little too quickly, but I felt you were drawing to a close. Were you complete for now? I wanted to interject that sometimes, it is demoralizing when I think about the level of disconnect that it has emerged at all levels, community, national, global, of between our leadership and the grassroots populations. And my heart has always been for all the reasons you've both been saying, working with the grassroots populations, because their common needs and desires and propensities and behaviors and concerns are so much more similar than they are different. And yet we're all being governed by leadership, a much tinier fraction of actual number of people that are calling shots for so many others. And this, sometimes Jim and I get together and we reminisce about the 1993 Parliament of the World's Religions in Chicago. He was global director and was again until the event in 2005 or 5. And I was program director in 1993. And one of the things that was so amazing was there were serious serious disputes among religious and political leaders, or some combination of the both, that was kind of taking over the headlines of what was going on with religion in the world at that time. But what we saw in front of our faces were all the other 7,000 or 8,000 people from the grassroots level, from the communities in their indigenous garb who came to the parliament. And they were enjoying the heck out of one another. They were talking in the elevators, and just the humanity of it was so flew in the face of what we were hearing. So I wondered, Jim, if you wanted to reminisce with me a little about that.
Well, it's funny that everyone who reminisces about the parliament, it always comes back to the elevators, because the elevators in the Palmer House were very capacious. They're very big elevators, and you had to wait for a long time to get one to move to the next event. But nobody minded the elevator rides, because you're there with maybe 20 people from all over the world. You're wearing these badges that say, yeah, I'm here for the parliament. And as my wife is fond of saying, just seeing that badge on someone else obviated the need for any small talk, introductory conversation. You could just jump in with the assumption that you had already something to talk about. And people were, the joy, the camaraderie, the insight into not the doctrines of one another, but of the humanness of one another. It was, and there were a lot of fun things too. The staff at the Palmer House restaurants had a great time reinventing the menu. The one thing I remember is the Hello Dolly burger, which is funny since he is a meat eater. But anyway, yeah, it was wonderful. Let me just throw in one other thing, which is that, again, I got Steven Pinker on the brain. And that little quote from Bill Gates saying, this is the time of the most dramatic progress in every single metric you can think of ever in human history. That's the big shocker. The second big shocker is that no one knows it. And so he gives this long list of exciting books and so on. And you heard me say, and he says, and here's what the Pulitzers went to: disease, terrorism, plane crashes, and so on. But Pinker explains something very interesting. He shows a graph of all the stories in the New York Times from 1990 on, and then a composite of the global media from 1990 on, in terms of the general tenor of coverage. I mean, was it downer coverage or was it uplifting coverage? And they both, from 1990, global media composite and the New York Times, they both go like this. My hand is going off the screen, but you know what I mean. They go straight down. And Pinker says that's why people are so terrified about air crashes, although they're almost vanishingly rare. That's why people are so terrified of ISIS coming across the border, although far more people die of lightning strikes than die of terrorist incidents. But there's a term, Ken was talking about bias. There's a term in psychology called availability bias. And it's a very oddly phrased, but basically what it means, if a concept is presented to you constantly by your daily intake of media and stories and so on, you multiply its reality in the world because it's so available to you in print and broadcast. You imagine that it is that available in the world at large. And you know that old saw, if it bleeds, it leads. You know, which story are we gonna print? Are we gonna print the story about everything's getting better, or the story about what a horrible thing just happened? Things are better. That's a critical feature of the time we live in. Things are better and getting better than most of us understand or realize.
Thanks.
Yeah,
well, we
go
have
ahead, Stephen.
Stephen, why don't you jump in? You've had your hand up for a minute.
Well, thank you. Yes. I guess I wanted to take both sides of the argument. And I love Steven Pinker's enthusiasm. And yeah, if you're worried about, for example, dying of a terrible disease, it's definitely now is the time you want to be here compared to any time in the past. On the other hand, it's important to look at it and say things like wealth concentration, that the feudal lords never had as high a percentage of all the wealth as the 1% does now. Even under Louis XIV or the famous robber barons or any period of history, the farmers had more. And so I think that you can make the argument that it's the best of times, the worst of times, to go from Pinker to Dickens. I think kind of trying to synthesize what Ken and Jim have been saying also, the task of people of faith has always been to look at the dark side and not let it get you down. And I think for many of us, we've had it so lucky the last 20 years that we could say, yeah, there are challenges, but life is grand and things are getting better. And it's like, well, you don't get credit for being able to do that in good times. It's the hard times. And I know from my own work, I go to prisons once a month and people ask me, why do you do that? And I said, well, you not going there doesn't mean they don't exist. There are people in these situations. And I think the general malaise, if you want to bring up that term, or the challenges that people see nowadays, and it's mainly people that listen to a lot of news, you still have to be able to look right at the darkest side and keep repeating the phrase, there's not enough darkness in the whole world to hide a single candle. So I think that's where we really need our faith to say, I'm going to be a realist and an optimist in the same breath.
I love that statement that you just said, that there isn't enough darkness in the whole world to block out a candle. And Troward says that darkness in and of itself is nothing less than the absence of light. And that's precisely what we're dealing with in our media, but we don't have to deal with it in our world. And I get it. There's lots of things that need to be transformed and changed in the world around us. I want to share something that I recently read from the Science of Mind magazine. It was an article by Reverend Andriette Earle. And Andriette gives a beautiful example of what's happening, in my opinion, to the world around us. She talks about David Letterman on Netflix interviewing Barack Obama. And I'll just read it. According to Obama, 3 people, a liberal, a conservative, and a moderate, were asked to Google Egypt. The liberal received information on Tahrir Square, where the revolution took place. The conservative saw information on the Muslim Brotherhood, and the moderate was taken to vacation spots on the Nile. Each searcher's previously expressed history, interests, and biases drew a different response during the search. And I think this is what Dr. Ernest Holmes meant when he said, whatever pattern we provide, that will be our demonstration. And I share that with you because I don't think we're that far from artificial intelligence to infinite intelligence. We get to pull from the infinite intelligence around us what it is that our interests are and where we lie. And if we want to see pain and anguish and frustration, it isn't very hard to do it. And if we center ourselves on it, we will. But I'll go back to what Jim and I think I've been saying from the very beginning of this webinar, is that there is a lot good that's happening. And that doesn't mean we get to ignore the bad. We have to deal with the good. And I remember when I twisted my knee skiing, and every morning I would get up to get out of bed and I'd swing my leg over on the side, and my wife Deborah would say, "How are you feeling today?" And I'd say, "Oh my God, my knee hurts so badly." And after about 3 days of that, I swung my leg over and I suddenly realized that the amount that I was talking about of pain in my leg came from a nerve ending that was about that big around. I mean, it was almost impossible to see. And yet, on the other hand, my arms felt good, my head felt good, my shoulders felt good, my other leg felt good. But I was giving it an inordinate amount of energy towards something that didn't feel very comfortable. And I think that that's where we need to make some transitional changes and transformational changes in the way that we think and the way that we look at things. And as we do so, what we'll find is the bad doesn't necessarily disappear because we've hidden it. But what happens is we actually give it the energy that it requires, and we start giving some energy to the good stuff that's happening, because the thing we teach and the thing we know to be true is where you put your energy expands. And that's the important part. We're expanding an awful lot of stuff we don't want right now, in my opinion, of which I have great respect.
Thank you, Ken. You know, we haven't really involved our listeners too much, and there's a friend of AG&T who's present in the webinar tonight, Jim Taylor, and I'm gonna see if I can get Jim on the screen here to ask his question or make his comment. Just a second here.
Hi.
Hi, Jim, are you there?
I am. I'm not visually here, but I think, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, wonderful. I just wanted to say that I've been enjoying immensely Jim Kenney's book. And one of the things that really delighted me was his mentioning of T.S. Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions, a very powerful book, most important book I read when I was in college in the 70s. The piece that he wanted to emphasize, besides the paradigm shift that everyone knows, is the piece of anomaly. And as the book plays out, as the story is told, anomalies accumulate until they're rejected originally. And those who advocate for any kind of meaning to the anomalies are considered crazy, and it's so forth. But eventually, enough anomalies accumulate, and a younger generation of scientists begin to assemble those anomalies into plausible new theories. Now, I have a son who's 30 years old and works in naval intelligence, and that generation for a long time frustrated me because they seemed so disengaged. But what I've come to realize is that they are very aware, and they are keenly aware of these anomalies. And there's a tremendous amount going on amongst people who don't consider themselves spiritual, who don't consider themselves necessarily engaged in the whole process, but a whole bunch of collecting, collating, and reassembling these anomalies. And that gives me great hope for the future.
Thank you so much, Jim. We look forward to meeting you in person at the Parliament of Religions in Toronto in November. So thanks for being and sharing your comment with us tonight.
Thank you to all of you. So
we're wrapping up the program for tonight, and I've enjoyed it very much. And I would like to first give Jim an opportunity to make some brief closing remarks, and then Ken will make some closing remarks, and then we'll say goodnight for the evening. So Jim, if you'd like to go ahead now.
I will say one quick thing back to Stephen, which is give Steven Pinker a chance. Don't assume that he only wants to talk about the fact that this is a good time not to die of disease. He talks extensively about wealth inequity and so on, and with great sensitivity and great probity, I think. So it's worth giving him a chance. I mean, it's not just a Pollyanna song. But I found myself writing a piece about outrage in our time. And the basic idea is that I think outrage can be one of the most legitimate, in a sense, emotions, as long as you move into it and move with it. I mean, if you're never outraged by anything, you're not paying attention. You're not being thoughtful. Anyway, just as, so I'm skipping ahead then, just as outrage, and this is all I wrote, just as outrage demands reflection, so does our insistent modern urging toward patriotism. Patriotism, and that's what was in play in Italy. Inevitably, the question arises, what is patriotism? Is it a hymn of praise to flag and anthem? A song of connection to our national past? Well, of course it is. And we honor that at every 4th of July and now at every sporting event. Basta. Anyway, but isn't it also a hymn of hope? Here's what I have in mind. Patriotism can point backward or forward. Both orientations have merit. When I gaze back into our honored past, I see the heroic and visionary founders of our national experiment. But I can also gaze into the future of the experiment, and what might that mean? The most essential fact of cultural evolution is the grounding in the deep truths of its forging. And so as I acknowledge the touchstones of the past, I project their very best values forward: fairness and justice, integrity and honor, and kindness and compassion. So what is patriotism in our early 21st century? I think that it's global citizenship. Can I be a real citizen of the United States or of Britain, France, Germany, China, Brazil, if I'm not first and always a citizen of the earth with all the requisite responsibilities and duties? Seems improbable, doesn't it? So let's hold that thought, and above all, let's pass it on to the next generation.
Well, thank you, Jim, for that. I can't imagine a more appropriate and beautiful quote that you could have brought in at this point. It's really, it's sobering, but also hopeful at the same time. So Ken, I'd like to also ask you if you have a couple closing remarks that you'd like to make right now.
Barbara, and thank you, Jim. This has been a remarkable conversation. I'm very pleased with it. The closing remark that I would like to make is really in alignment with what Jim was just talking about. I don't think that we have to worry if we nurture our youth and our youngsters as to what's going to happen in the world ahead of us. Evolution by its very nature means that the generation that follows a generation has a greater and a more developed consciousness if given the opportunity than the one that came before it. And I just think back on when I first became a minister and I moved up to Kelowna, British Columbia, which was my hometown from Palm Springs. And when I got there, the first class I ever gave, I felt so arrogant and so great. I was going to come and tell all these secrets to all these people that are there. And I taught my first class in a grade 3 classroom. And I walked in and there's these adults sitting in these little grade 3 chairs and desks. And I remember looking at them and thinking, oh boy, are they ever in for a treat? And then I looked up, and on the balance of the ceiling that went all the way around were all of the affirmations, and in a nutshell, in about 40 different little pages, was everything that I learned in 6 years of study. The simple fact of the matter is that the kids who came out of grade 3 in that classroom have a greater foundation and a greater grounding in this teaching because they've lived it from the very beginning of their lives than I ever dreamt of having. It's our responsibility as their wise elders, and sometimes not so wise elders, to be able to nurture and nourish that so that they can develop and bring it into the world in a big way. I'm very confident for the future. The young adults that I know today that are entering into the world of spirituality and ministry within CSL, they are, each and every one of them is miles ahead of me. And I've been running like crazy just to keep ahead of them. So God bless them all. We're in good hands.
Thank you, Ken and Jim and Stephen, and to all of our attendees tonight and those who will be watching the recording later. Every time I'm privileged enough to be part of one of these conversations, I always come away feeling energized instead of demoralized, which is often the way that I start, because I'm coming out of the world into a focused conversation that puts on some clear-sighted spectacles and takes the good with the bad, but frames it in a way that allows me to have the energy to keep on keeping on, so to speak. So I want to thank you very much for such a good conversation. And to say that the recording will be available tomorrow. Everybody will get an email that gives a link to the recording. We'll be taking a break from New Thought on the News in June because we've got some other things that conflict going on. So there won't be a program on June 21st, but we'll be back on Thursday, July 26th. And at that time, we'll be with Jim Kenny and Dr. David Goldberg, who is the editor-publisher of Science of Mind magazine. So thank you all very much for being part of this tonight, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
Blessings.
Thanks, Barbara.